Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. It's time to talk about Sweden when it comes to War Thunder, because Sweden is one of those nations that not a ton of people really bring up a lot when it comes to the history of War Thunder. And the reason is because they haven't been in it that long, and also at the same time, they're one of those nations which kind of just gets hidden to the side and quietly does okay when it comes to the general players. But there are some issues with it, and have been for a long time, and hopefully what can happen as we go along is these things can be fixed. So right now, the major issue that Sweden had was, of course, how long it took to be added. You know, just like some other nations like Israel, it kind of came out of nowhere, and because it took so long to be added, they're still not in a place where they have access to all of the separate things that other nations do. For example, there's still no naval tech tree, there's still not a ton of BRs which are full of vehicles. Instead, you have still some BRs which only have individual vehicles. This was something that happened to Japan for a long time until they started getting what would be classed as parity updates, where they started getting like variants of vehicles or prototypes of vehicles to try and fill the gaps. And we're still not at that point where Sweden is at parity. They don't have any naval stuff. Their helicopters are probably as good as they can be, but still pretty rough. And also, they still have some BRs in the mid-tiers where there isn't a ton of people. Or there isn't a ton of vehicles, I should say. They did add Finland to try and help them out, but why has it not been expanded to other nations too? Where are all of the other Northern European countries to try and fill them out? So far at the moment, it's taken ages for that to happen. The next thing is, for the longest time, they had incredibly high repair costs. Stuff like the SCRV 122s, insanely high repair costs, and also there was just some mid-tier vehicles which also had some incredibly high ones for their general performance. Now, it is true that a lot of vehicles, especially in mid-tier aviation for Sweden, were pretty strong. You know, the J22s, J21s, A21s, and of course in ground you have a lot of the light vehicles which are really nice, and of course the SCRV 122s, which were pretty good as well. But the problem that they had is they all got raised in BR, and they all got up-tiered incredibly aggressively, especially the aviation, but because of how the systems used to work in War Thunder, basically the BRs went up, but the repair costs didn't go down. The old way, and hopefully that way is gone now, of how this stuff would work, is the repair costs were seen as separate to the BR changes. So the BRs would increase on a vehicle, but then people would stop playing it because the repair costs were too high, therefore nothing would change about it because the stats didn't come in to effectively, attack the vehicle. This happened to a lot of stuff. The Lorraine 40T in the French is the best example, where it kept going up in BR, its repair costs went through the roof, it got to a BR of 7.7, there was better options, people stopped playing the Lorraine, but its repair costs still stayed really high. This happened with a ton of Swedish vehicles, especially mid-tier aviation as well, and this kind of screwed them. Luckily this is kind of fixed, but there's still some inklings of it here and there. And with the fact that they still don't have parity, once again, with the naval vehicles and with everything else, it meant that a lot of vehicles became lone wolf killers for the good old Swedish. Also, at the same time, they just have a lot of vehicles which aren't what you'd class as standard and therefore don't exactly fit, the meta. Stuff like the PBV 301, stuff like even the SCRV 74, which I enjoy, or even some of the other vehicles which heavily rely on certain modifications to be quite good, and also even some of the high-tier AAs that are around don't do very well because they just don't fit exactly how the game's played, and this kind of sucks for them. Like, for example, pretty much all of rank 1 and 2 for Sweden relies on a rank 4 APDS modification. If you don't have that modification, your vehicles are pretty useless, but once you get it, you become meta-defining, and that means that the game is not really set up for them. The game is pretty much set up in a way which kind of ignores them and hopes that they fit in as they go along, where instead it's obviously more set up for the major nations. And that sucks. That really does at the end of the day. Then you obviously have the different, as we talked about, different types of vehicles like the SCRV 74 and many others, but one of them has become kind of infamous in War Thunder's history now, since it was added, and to this day it is still infamous on how it's played. The SCRV 103 series of vehicles. It was one of the first vehicles that they brought in for Sweden as their grounds came in. You could buy the SCRV 1030, which was in. Then they added the A, and then of course the C. What is amazing is they still haven't added the B variant, or the D variant, but the B variant was in the files for the longest time, and they just never added it. I'm guessing they'll bring it back at some point, probably for an event vehicle, or probably for some kind of squadron vehicle, but they probably realized after adding the 103s that they just couldn't get the whole aiming mechanic right for the vehicles. So then what ended up happening is they couldn't really add anything else. They brought in the VT-12 first, which had this mechanic, and even though Sweden was known for their cheese wedges, they weren't the first to get access to the new mechanic. But even with the VT-12, it showed issues kind of going forward. And when the 103s came out, it really showed how broken this mechanic was. The 103s were just dipping and diving. They were basically wandering and dancing all over the place when you hit it. Whenever there was a change in inclination, or the tracks were on different altitudes or contours or whatever you want to call it, they just weren't able to get the gun on target, and then you would shuffle down or up hills if you ended up doing it. Now, once again, it's better. Is it perfect? Oh no, it's still in a rough state, especially if you play it with a non-spaded vehicle. And because of this, it meant the SCRV 103s, even though could be pretty good in areas because of other ideas, it meant that they were so hard to spade and so hard to play for new players that it massively put off a lot of other people. Another mechanic which has also gone to the wayside in its usability was hull brake. And hull brake was one of those which really affected a lot of Sweden, because Sweden has a ton of light vehicles, whether it's the IKV-91s, whether it's the STR-Fs at higher tiers. All of these vehicles would get shot through by like APF-SDS. Nothing would hit any compartment, and then they would just die because of the hull brake mechanic, and it was so annoying. And now with overpressure, the vehicles are a lot better, but still have similar issues where they will just get bonked by random things and then just end up dying. So hull brake was horrific for so many vehicles for Sweden, and that just really, once again, kind of screwed them. And the biggest one, at least for me, was the BR changes. There was a lot of the aviation that came out for Sweden, the J21s, the A21s, the J22s, all of these vehicles, even higher tier stuff like the J29s, which are just horrific to play with. And every vehicle that felt nice for Sweden got ramped up in BR super quickly, which just sucked. The only ones which didn't were the B-18s and the T-18s, and that's basically because they were used mainly by people who were botting the game, which were never dealt with and still exist, by the way, because Sweden was the easiest nation to get to higher ranks with. Therefore, people used and abused the referral reward system to be able to get some nice goodies on their account. So you had that issue as well, plaguing Sweden, giving them a bad name. The other one as well is, of course, CAS for Sweden has always been incredibly limited. There was plenty of vehicles for Sweden which are pretty good in air-to-air, but are completely useless in the CAS configuration, and it's one of the problems they've had as a nation for the longest time in the highest echelon. They don't have huge effective ways of dealing with CAS, unless you're talking about the highest ITO nowadays, but in those mid-tiers you can get reamed by helicopters, you can get reamed by general CAS, but they just do not have a effective method of dealing with long-range CAS, stuff like Mavericks, stuff like helicopters. And because of that, you don't have vehicles which are very good multi-rollers at those BRs. You know, left with stuff at the high tiers for the longest time, the J29D, which you had to buy, and was also awful for gas, but pretty much the only option you have. Even the ones that they brought in now still aren't great when you compare them to other vehicles, and always has been a bit of a problem. So Sweden, even today, has issues in the game. It has a history of kind of anti-player tactics, stuff like like, of course, higher repair costs and also higher BRs, and hopefully at some point will be fixed going forward. But right now, I'm pretty doubtful. I think they'll just keep throwing vehicles from other nations at the tech tree and hope people enjoy it. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Millie Draper, Juan the Panda, Nick R. Kupila, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Merciless Reaper, Orange Tail, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Moxie B. Young, Peter Grayling, Jerry Provolt, Bareen, Alan Hacker, Sem Arslan, Uncle Bean, Derek R., and Lafouche for supporting the channel.